My name is Anya Leonard. I am the founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. We've been operating since 2012, and of late, Alexandra Hudson and myself have been doing a series called The Great Conversations, and we have been very fortunate to have a series of wonderful guests to delve into interesting topics regarding the classics, how relevant they are. So this conversation, I will let Alexandra Hudson moderate. She is the curator of Civic Renaissance, a newsletter dedicated to truth and beauty. We'll be having our conversation, and then afterwards we will turn to the Q&A. You can feel free to turn in questions at any point in the chat. We will be addressing them later on at the end of the conversation, about 45 minutes into the conversation. So with that, I will turn you over to Lexi, who will introduce our guest this time.
Thank you, Anya, and thanks to all of you for joining us live and those who are choosing to watch the recording. It's my privilege to be with you all today with my new and dear friend, Spencer Klavan, to talk about whether the classics are for everyone and how might we better democratize the classics, both practically, but also conceptually as well. So Spencer is an associate editor at the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, and he's also the host of the very popular Young Heretics podcast, which guides especially younger audiences through great texts in the Western tradition. And he's also the author of a book on music in ancient Greece, which is based on his graduate work and research and dissertation at Oxford, I think. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Spencer, for joining us and being with us today to talk about this exciting and timely and topical topic.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to you both for that introduction. I'm excited. It's a topic that's near to my heart, and I know it is to yours as well. So looking forward.
Yes. So we are here to talk about whether the classics are for everyone and whether they have been historically for everyone. Anya, do we have any poll results to share yet? Maybe we can kind of get a baseline at the beginning of our conversation and then reevaluate at the end.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I thought this is our first time using a poll, but I just thought it was very interesting. So for the first question, do you think the classics are currently classist? Only 11% said yes, no was 36%, and over half has thought partially. Do you think the classics have historically been only for the elite? 18% said yes, 46% no, and 36% said at times. And the biggest obstacles for the working class to join in the realm of classics is language prerequisites. Latin and Greek only said 11%. And this is an interesting one because this has historically been a major point of contention. 24% said access to educational resources, 41% said cultural norm and expectations, and 21% said available time to dedicate to study. So I think that's pretty, and we got a 76% response rate. So it's interesting.
Those are such interesting results.
Yes. I wish that there were I could click multiple options for that last one, because I think a lot of those those answers, like language prerequisites, especially availability of time and leisure time, and access to educational opportunities, those are all components that that have contributed to the elitist association of the classical degree, but also education generally, like not just the classics. So one kind of conceptual distinction I wanted to make as we talk about this conversation that we've talked about in past dialogues is the difference between big C and small c classics. Big C classics, as I conceive it, that's like the discipline, the academic discipline of antiquity, of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And then small c classics is, like Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, that's a classic. Okay, it's like just the broader kind of use of this term that refers to a great book, a great work of art, just something that contributes to the humanistic project and the broader kind of great conversation, the great books, dialogue that are not exclusively ancient Greece and ancient Rome. I think that's important because I think we're talking about both of those, big C and small c, as part of this conversation, especially since we're talking about the classics, but the classics have been a part of education broadly, as have these other great books by other authors, not exclusively rooted in antiquity. So I'd like to start by asking Spencer, what do you think? Are the classics for everyone? Have they been for everyone? Let's just start from square one. What do you think, Spencer?
Well, I was surprised and also pleased to find that I was in the majority on 2 of 3 of those poll questions. I didn't expect to be, but on the first 2, I agree that the answer to the first question is partially, and I agree. I'm forgetting now what the second question was, but I think it had to do with what was the second question?
Historically, has it been?
Historically, right? Has it been for everybody? And I think the answer to that question is emphatically no. Although I think that as we discuss throughout this conversation, we'll probably talk about different periods that have had different kind of cultural standards about what it means to be educated, what is required to gain admission to the upper classes or the elite, what that means, whether that's an economic signifier or a cultural signifier or both. So I absolutely think that those standards have shifted throughout time and history. But I think that, in my country, the legacy of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln alone testifies to, the incredible democratizing power of classics, as well as the power to create elites and sustain elites. The reason that this topic is so near to my own heart is in part that you mentioned this podcast that I host, Young Heretics. And it really was a bit of a lark for me because in the States, we have this culture war raging about whether the classics should be taught in school. And that applies to both levels of C that you identified, Lexi. There's, questions about whether you should have to learn Greek and Latin to do a degree in big C classics. But there are also questions about whether curricula should, hew to the canon, or whether that's too white, too privileged, too anything. And so one thing that I noticed was really missing from both sides of that debate was actually reading the classics. I found that, I will play my cards. I'm a conservative in the American scheme, and I'm more on the side of wanting the classics to be read. I think they are not just kind of gatekeeping markers or signifiers of class, but actual residue and records of the greatest things that have been thought and said, at least some of them, and that they humanize us, as we were discussing before we started recording. So that's my side in that fight, as it were. But one thing I noticed was that for all the pounding on the table that we do about how we ought to read Homer, about how we need to read Jane Austen, about how we're not actually, all that time we're not actually spending reading Homer and Jane Austen and talking about them and why it is that we need to read them. So that's what Young Heretics is. And I thought, well, this will flop because, this will be a kind of nerdy podcast that nobody really wants to listen to. Instead, what I found was this incredible hunger. I mean, this real voracious response that this was something people never thought was for them. And that was what struck me about it, was the very, the self-perception of people in what you might call the working class, that the thing that I was presenting to them is something that it wasn't for them, either because it required incredibly specialized knowledge, or was too complicated, or wasn't about the life that they were actually living. And so I started to feel that in America, at least, there is a whole class of people, not necessarily conservative, not necessarily Republican voting. I think my audience might skew that way, but it's by no means, all to the right, who simply haven't been taught, for whatever reason, that a book like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is a book about how to be good at being human, which, they think it's a book with a lot of fancy words in it that you have to learn Greek to read and so forth. And I started to ask myself why that is. And one thing that I realized is that whereas in societies like, for example, 19th century England, classics had become a kind of marker of cultural erudition, and even certain things like how you pronounced Latin could mark you out as unfit for upper echelon society. In America, thanks in part to the internet and in part to a really radical kind of assessment of classics, the worth of classics in our higher education academies, there's this kind of renaissance, this populist renaissance in classics going on. And whereas I think it's always been the case that people who are not super wealthy can do wonderful things with classics, can elevate themselves and their social standing with classics. It's not always been the case that anybody who realizes classics are for them can log on and listen to a podcast or click on a website and read a pretty good translation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, or any one of the texts in the online Library of Liberty that are in public domain. All of these things are suddenly and hugely available. And so no, I definitely don't think classics are only for the elite. I do think, though, that we ought to be unapologetic about their excellence. And there's a distinction there as well, right? It's one thing to say that certain types of people can't have access to this thing, either because they don't have the money or the time, or just because we don't think of them as good enough. That in itself is I think a kind of elitism. It's another thing to say that these are texts which require merit and reward sustained and focused attention, and to ask, how in the digital age can we empower people to pay them that attention? I think the barriers to that are different somewhat now than they were in the past. Time is a big one. Language is a big one, but also, just awareness, realization that this is even something that would be worth doing, is a gospel that could stand preaching. So there's my sort of initial set of thoughts, Lexi, and maybe you have follow-up questions.
Anya, anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things to add to it, to be honest. I don't even know where to start, but I think it's funny that you said about one thing that we were talking about beforehand was about reading Edith Hall's book about the people's history of classics. And I think that is really valuable for people to realize that the classics historically have been read by working class people in the UK, and that she outlines it through looking at memoirs and autobiography and poetries and things, unions, even referencing the classics. So, we actually have tangible illustrations of how the working class in the UK and in Ireland, enjoyed using the classics historically. So I think that is something to always keep in mind, that it has this sort of past. But to your point, Spencer, about culture, it's funny that in the poll, people thought culture is being one of the greatest obstacles. And so the idea is that people might not realize the value of the classics, not that they don't have access to it, not that it's that incapable of studying them or that, but that there is not the culture to want to study them.
I think, that perception, which is also a self-perception. I mean, there's two parts to this perception. There's classics aren't worth my time, and there's I'm not worthy of classics. And they actually come sometimes together or sometimes separately. The external perception can come, for example, from a pretty widespread tendency to malign classics along exactly these lines, that it's exclusionary, that it is, in some sense designed to be exclusionary, that its whole function is not to elevate the best that has been thought and said, but instead to keep certain people out of the conversation, which I just think historically is flatly wrong. And then there's the self-perception, which is something I noticed, or even before starting the podcast, that many of my most interesting friends and conversation partners, when they found out that I myself had been to some of these very fancy elite institutions, prefaced their observations about life, the universe, and everything with the disclaimer that they weren't a very interesting or smart person. And usually when you dug into that, and I always respond to that and say, why do you say that? And usually the answer has something to do with, I was homeschooled, or I I have only been reading these things on my own. And typically I'm more interested in what they have to say because they've, they don't come at these texts from some preset, structure of ideas that has been caked over their brain. But even leaving that aside, I think that's a separate dimension of this cultural barrier, is just the idea that like people like me, for whatever reason, people who are not white, people who are poor, people who live in rural communities, people who are homeschooled, like people like me don't have a right to the classics, like don't have access, can't speak on this topic, don't have interesting things to say.
So it seems like we're asking and then answering two core questions in this conversation. First is the titular question of this event, which is, are the classics really for everyone? Which I hear both of our panelists saying, yes, they are. And then I think that other question that we've kind of been hinting at is, have they been for everyone? And the answer has really been yes and no a little bit, that there have been certainly some economic and social barriers to people having access to certain educational opportunities and even literacy. We know that, we're at this, we have an unprecedentedly high literacy rate today. And as Spencer was saying, access to free and very high quality and affordable translations of texts that render it so we don't even necessarily need to have training in the original Greek and Latin to enjoy and benefit from some of these classic texts. So I'd like to take a stab at answering both those questions. As we've talked about a lot in these conversations, that whether big C and small c classics are for everyone, yes, because they're very much in the humanistic tradition, the liberal arts tradition, that has the purpose of liberating us. That's what the liberal arts do. They help accentuate what is best in our nature and diminish what is base in our nature. They by exposing us to beauty and goodness and truth in philosophy and literature and theater and the arts, and by getting this well-rounded education, we're drawn towards the good, and that which is best in our nature is accentuated and nurtured. And it also cultivates our humanity, helps us appreciate our own humanity and the humanity of others, those around us, to the end of helping us be more humane too. Humanity and humaneness is often the antonym of cruelty and barbarism. And I think that cultivating that would cultivating that appreciation of what it means to be human and all things, and cultivating a passion for the human condition, that is an important part of my work on civility and civil discourse. That the more that we fall in love with this thing called humanity and the human condition, the less inclined we are to be cruel, even to people on the internet or people that we disagree with. And not just there are these instrumental benefits of an education generally, but it also just objectively helps us appreciate the beauty in the world around us. And everyone deserves a chance, of all class backgrounds, all stripes, to understand who they are, right? The examined life, which is a core part of this humanistic tradition, the great conversation, and what they stand for and what they want out of life. Like we all deserve that opportunity. And I think my question is, and I'd love to hear from both of you, like Spencer, you mentioned, how might we take advantage of all these opportunities that our current era offers us, with more leisure time, more free time, more disposable income, more access, more literate, more educated generally, more access to all of these resources and high quality translations. It's kind of a paradox of our times that we are in this golden age of information, yet we are also bombarded with every sort of distraction that, like, things demanding our attention in real time than ever before in history too. We're more connected to the internet and one another, which can be a great thing, but also can be a source of distraction and frustration as well. So how might we kind of maximize the benefits that this era offers us and minimize the frustrating parts, the parts that might take us away from truly enjoying both the big C and the small c classics?
It's so interesting, this question, because it hits on the very origin of the idea of the liberal arts, right? Which is that it is what you do with your leisure time. That, and this is in part where we get our idea that classics are only for rich people, because as Aristotle starts to talk about this, right, he says that you need a certain amount of money and you need a certain amount of leisure. You need to be essentially a nobleman to have that time to sit in quiet contemplation, to, you know, gaze into the middle distance and think about the meaning of life. And you know, we therefore call these arts the liberal arts in part because they're, you know, what you do when you are liberated from the constraints of earning a living. And it is the case that we, you know, many hundreds of years later, 2,300 years later, we live in a world where, you know, with a relative modicum of industry, you actually can have not a, you know, a life of free time that would, I mean, that the university sort of exists in some part to still create a life of contemplation for some people to sort of be professionals at it. But we also have a system that, you know, a capitalist system, in my view, that creates a certain amount of leisure for people in the working class. And as you pointed out, when you lifted up your phone, it turns out that, you know, myself included, when we have that leisure, we don't always use it to cultivate the contemplative mind, right? We don't actually use it to develop and bless our rational faculties. And so this is, you know, in some sense, a question of values, and in another sense, a question of the will. I mean, I think that one dimension that we haven't touched on yet that might help answer this question is the dimension of expertise, which is a much maligned concept, that there might be people that, you know, are sort of whose job it is to be experts in something. And in part, I think that is because of a fair amount of betrayal of the role of the expert. But that leads us then to reflect on what the role of the expert is, which is not, in fact, to, you know, cultivate his expertise for its own sake, but at least in part, right, to be a guide and guardian of things that, you know, might otherwise just seem like a cacophony. I mean, this is the problem with the internet, is that it comes washing over us like some kind of waterfall, and we kind of flail around in it. And the thing that's most shiny and attractive to us is immediately the thing that's easiest to go for. And so in some sense, I think that another thing that the internet has done is made available expert instruction in, you know, that would otherwise be restricted to a seminar room. I mean, you can go on a podcast app right now and get a series of lectures on Dante. You can hear our friend Catherine Illingworth talk at great length about Dante, you know, from a place of profound knowledge. And this finally speaks to the one last thing that I'll say before I shut up, which is that the nature of expertise in the liberal arts is, I think, somewhat different than the nature of expertise in the sciences, for example. And we miss this when we talk about expertise, that the scientific experts exist to make things for us in some ways, but also to discover things about the universe that perhaps may be completely impenetrable to us. And there are, you know, there are channels of communication between us and them. But in my view, the expert in the liberal arts is in some sense charged with discovering things that will actually enable the average person to understand what the heck Pindar is going on about. And that there is actually a relationship, ideally supposed to be a relationship. I mean, one of the things that people feel betrayed about, I think, is that they don't understand what the relationship is between, like, most scholarly papers that get written on Pindar and their experience picking up a book of Pindar. And I think that the existence of forums like this is in part a boon because it sort of bridges that gap again. You know, I think we can, I mean, there are other places, the Albertus Magnus Institute, our friends at Classic Learning Test, like there's an enormous array of resources here. And I think that, like, seeking out guides who actually mean to guide you and aren't in it for their own sake is one way that you can kind of tamp down the noise.
Absolutely. One of our recent conversations was with Zena Hitz of St. John's College in Annapolis, who wrote a lovely book called Lost in Thought why we need to rediscover leisure in our everyday, and started the Catherine project, which offers free tutorials in the classics, in the great books, not just both big C and small C classics, as we've been using that parlance. Maybe we can link to the Catherine project in case people are interested in taking advantage of that resource. But again, like to your point, Spencer, that's a brand new resource. And I think there are lots of other resources. There's also something called the Scala Foundation, which is doing something similar, offering these free or affordable tutorials. There's a new initiative called Politeness that our friend James Hankins, Spencer at Harvard University, and he's been on these conversations with us as well. One of his former students, he is kind of utilizing the undertapped intellectual potential of adjunct scholars and allowing them to kind of like they have office hours, so people can pay them 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or an hour to talk about Homer. Or you could have an office hour, Spencer, talking about classical music and antiquity or something like that. Like if someone is wants access to an expert to kind of augment their own independent study of a certain topic, kind of just connecting learners with subject matter experts in a really innovative and unique way that's called Polis. So anyway, all that to say, Spencer, to your point that there are these burgeoning initiatives that are meeting this populist demand for the life of the mind and big C and small C classics that I think it's worth noting, worth celebrating, worth taking advantage of these resources that are often free or very affordable and very available. So I'd love to talk about another point. The other question that we've kind of been reflecting on in this conversation so far is the accessibility of the classics throughout history as well. And I think it's worth noting some prominent examples of members of what we now think of as part of the kind of the canon, the great conversation today, that were part of the underclass in their day. I'm thinking Aesop and Epictetus, who were slaves. I'm thinking of Saint Augustine, who was a Berber, which etymologically that comes from the Greek word barbarian. Like that's how the Greeks understood anyone who didn't speak Greek, they were barbarian. and the Romans adopted that mentality as well. You were either Roman and civilized, or you were barbarian. You were just everyone else. And so Augustine was very much on the periphery of the sort of civilized world and during the end of the Roman Empire. But these are still all people who are very squarely in kind of the canon of both of antiquity, of big C classics. And today, like what do we make of that? Like that they were members of an underclass that in their day, were they just exceptions to the rule? I'm just curious, how do we think through that?
Well, it causes me to reflect on, the nature of classics as a sort of bridge between classes. I mean, and it's true that when we initially start to think about this question, right, we raise examples like I cited Lincoln and Douglas, right? One born into poverty, the other born into slavery, and both autodidacts whose classical education was a major sort of facilitator of the incredible things that they did, from that position. And we almost look at that as a more admirable. I mean, Douglas is fond of saying that he stole a classical education. Other people got one, he stole one. And looking back, of course, we recognize the nobility in that. And almost admire it more. I think also even of Cicero, a controversial figure, but one I admire greatly, and who was remarkable in part because he was a novus homo, a new man, which meant that he didn't come from patrician blood, and so this is certainly, I mean, in some sense, it's a slightly different phenomenon than we're talking about with this. I mean, the digital phenomenon is genuinely new, I think, in the way that it has blown the doors open on some of this stuff. But we do cite this, I think, these examples of people, more of them than we can count when we start thinking about them. Lexi, you mentioned a bunch, we've brought up others, who are either self-taught or whose education was in itself a kind of route from one class into another. In some sense, it's the only such route that we know of. I mean, one last thing that I would say about that is that it is, in my view, utopian dream that there would exist a society on Earth without some kind of elite, that there would never be a group of people or a set of ideas or even a set of credentials that are regarded by other people as desirable and exclusive. And in some sense, that set of ideas is going to then set the aspirations of those who maybe don't even want to be in that set, but who are, thinking of them, thinking of self-improvement, right? I mean, what counts as elite and expert knowledge at the most respected universities also helps to determine, rightly or wrongly, what counts as self-improvement in the lower classes when we do sit down to read our books. Like, what are the things that we're going to read and educate ourselves in? And I think that is an inherent structure of human society, and that really the only question on the table is, what are the things that going to be that we are aspiring to? And so, it's always been my contention that the rallying cry for any populist movement should not be destroy the elite, but get us a better elite, or, make elite values better. And this is something that I think, when you talk about people who move from one class to another with elite education, you're talking about, Douglas, Cicero, Lincoln, these guys that we're mentioning, right? You're talking about people who, when they thought about how do I, rise in the world, had to go back and read Shakespeare and read the Greeks, and they were sent to those people. It seems to me better than that they should have been sent to, to use an incendiary example, Ibram X. Kendi or Robin DiAngelo. I mean, I just think that, there ought to be, we ought to have a care for what people instinctively turn to when, as they inevitably will, they turn to books that they hope will make them rise in the world.
I think that's a great point. And just to say, it's very interesting because, I've been reading up on like the different sides of determining class and the classics. And one argument people might have is that in that circumstance, people use the classics to transcend their station rather than embrace it or be comfortable with it. And, when I read that, I was like, I don't know how I feel about it, because I felt like the word transcend wasn't about just trying to improve your station, but to have a better perspective on life in general. That by having access to the classics, I mean, there's so many times, like Frederick Douglass, people have said like that, who have said the classics, it's like they're speaking directly to you. And at any time, in any generation, in any place, because they're ideas. And so rather than it just being a method in which to change your category as seen by outside of by the rest of society, maybe it also allows you to just reassign your own worth and your own ideas and your own concept of class. I don't know. I'm just thinking that out loud.
No. I mean, I think in this context of three people, one, W.E.B. Du Bois, who writes that famous passage in Souls of Black Folk about, I sit with Shakespeare, he winces not, arm in arm with Aristotle, I move across the color line, and so forth. And funnily enough, that passage always calls to mind a letter that Machiavelli wrote in exile to his friend and sort of confidant about his hour. Vittori, thank you.
He wrote that letter today, 508 years ago. I know that because I just put my newsletter out about it. I'll link in the chat. Yeah.
Awesome. How appropriate. That's perfect, because it speaks exactly what we're talking about, right? I mean, he's obviously not in anywhere near the kind of dire circumstances that a Douglas is. And yet he's also saying that, in my leisure hours, when I'm done with the things I have to do, then I enter into conversation with these great men. And they are, they take me out of my circumstances. They don't disdain to talk to me. And then finally, I think about, that Edith Hall book that you mentioned comes along with a website. I think it's called Classics in Class or something. And it's just a bunch of little vignettes of working class people reading the classics. And one of them that really struck me was this stonemason who loved Homer. And he said that Homer could throw a javelin better than any other writer. They practically whiz across the page. And I thought that's a wonderful observation about Homer that is probably more likely to come out of a stonemason than almost anybody else, and so I think, you're right. If you're rising, there's no point rising in class per se, unless by doing so, what you really mean is that you're attempting to refine what is best in you, as Lexi was saying. And in some senses, I think that can be as much a conversation, from the lower class to the elites as vice versa, right? I mean, it's not, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that a lot of the lower class engagement with classics actually reveals stuff about it that would be lost on, just on pampered elites.
I love
Another
this, by the way. Sorry, Lex, just very quickly.
No, go ahead.
That I think one of the things that I'm gleaning from you, Spencer, is that we're saying to people, yeah, the classics are great for the working class. Classics are great for the middle class. Classics are great for the upper class. Classics are great for everybody. We should be encouraging everybody on every spectrum to be partaking of it more. There isn't one group that has an ownership of it, and it should be kind of across the board more encouraged to improve, virtue.
Absolutely.
It reminds me of a famous discussion so there's a book called Class by Paul Fussell, the social critic from the 90s, and he has a discussion about, and it's a great book, great read, but hard to tell sometimes when he's joking and when he's being serious. But one point he makes is that the upper class, the ultra elite, they tend to pretend at classics, like pretend at erudition and take their education, and it is a badge of distinction. And at the very end of his book, he makes the case for what he calls the classless class. And he says the classless class are people that enjoy beauty and goodness for its own sake. They enjoy good wine, they enjoy good books, like they're not being pretentious, they're enthusiasts. So my husband often makes a distinction between a pretentious person and an enthusiastic person, someone who really sincerely appreciates, good wine or good coffee, as opposed to someone who simply pretends to just so they can look down on others or like feel better about themselves. But for the striving middle classes, and also for many members of the upper class, the classics are a tool of social exclusion to say who's in, who's out, whereas the classless class are the people who really appreciate it just for its intrinsic value, for its intrinsic beauty. I thought that was a really great insight. Like, how do we cultivate? I think we're beings that love to make these sort of distinctions. My book on civility, I talk about how in every time and every place there have been norms that help foster just like basic human relationships, and norms that are intended to divide, to show who's in and who's out. And especially amongst the elite in society, the norms tend to change, because as soon as the nouveau riche, the new man, as Spencer was saying, as soon as the parvenu, as soon as they learn the rules, then you have to change the rules, because otherwise you can't tell who's the elite, who's the true elite and who's not. So very anti-democratic. So like, how do we cultivate an ethos where we're not looking for these we're not eager to differentiate and exclude and find ways to distinguish between who's in and who's out, but are just appreciate the intrinsic beauty of great works of art, whether it's wine or a book, or a contribution from an author, a creator from history.
It's almost like Augustine's city within a city and city of God, that on earth, the city of God is mingled throughout every class, climb, location, because we can't visibly make the distinction, right? There is no actual physical place, and yet the place exists, and this is you're suggesting kind of, what Harry Jaffa, the sort of intellectual godfather of the institute that I work for, was fond of talking about the natural aristoi. He was looking to find aristoi in Greek, right? The best people, the aristocracy, right? And he meant that what he was trying to do was reach, in his classes, in his books, was reach the people who, whatever their level of honor and distinction in what Christians would call the world, with a capital W, nevertheless, right, are in some sense honored, right? That have a kind of facility with this sort of thing, that have talent and merit, And I think that, you know, you can take this too far, right? To a point where, as it's been pointed out about meritocracy, right? That it creates the situation where you think you deserve everything that happens to you, right? That, you know, but we are, I think, talking here about trying to align as much as possible our public honors and our elite groups and institutions with true eliteness, which is to say true excellence, right? And we recognize, in part because of our training in classics, that excellence exists, that there's such a thing as being, you know, more virtuous or less virtuous. And we are kind of talking about, you know, aspiring to a world where our classes reflect not just, you know, the kind of arbitrary social distinctions that exist, as you say, Lexi, precisely to keep people out, and must therefore change the minute anybody, you know, any social mobility comes into being, but instead to kind of create systems of honor and recognition that honor and recognize the right things.
Yeah, on the question of how the socioeconomic diversity within the canon, another example that, and sort of big C, small c classics, the great conversation generally, an example that comes to mind is the story of Benedict Spinoza. Spinoza is thought to have really influenced John Locke and his ideas of the separation of church and state, a core idea to modern liberal democracy. And Spinoza was a lens crafter. You know, he wasn't a slave like some of these other thinkers, or kind of on the periphery of society like some of these other people in the canon we've been talking about, but he was very much part of the working class. And he worked as a lens crafter by day and died an early death because of lung disease, where he had shards of glass in his lung, and moonlit as a philosopher by night. And his work is incredibly important and influential. And I like to juxtapose someone like Spinoza with someone like Michel de Montaigne. And Montaigne had every privilege you can imagine afforded to him, like incredibly, he had titles, he had wealth, he had the best education you could imagine in the classics, and also had a real joy for the life of the mind, a love of learning. And he didn't fritter away his privilege and his time. He actually was incredibly studious and incredibly prolific his entire life, and actually like secluded himself in his tower in Bordeaux for the last 10 years of his life, where he was born and died. And it's been the last 10 years of his life I'm just reading and contemplating the good and engaging in the great conversation. And so here are two examples, one of very much, you know, the working class disposition that really worked hard to make the most of the time that he did have, and someone with incredible privilege that really used it well. And like Michel de Montaigne's essays were seminal to the Enlightenment project and the Reason project. He was critical of the ethnocentrism of his day, critical of wars of religion over his day. Like he was very ahead of his time, according to our modern barometer, and on many issues, on many topics. And we can be grateful to him for his contributions, because he made the most. He could have just been, you know, on his yacht in the south of France, but he chose to spend his time reading and studying and cultivating his mind. So what I take from that is that it's not always about what resources we do have, what time we do have. It's how we use the time that we do have, that really can matter to kind of the question of how do we make the most of the resources at our disposal today, Spencer, like the internet, education, literacy. I think that's worth remembering.
You know, two pieces of English literature come to mind as you're talking and as we're thinking about this idea of, you know, of recognizing real merit rather than constructing kind of false systems of eliteness. One is an essay by Joseph Addison, which is an allegory of justice. He dreams, or he says he dreams, an allegory of justice, in which justice herself, personified, descends to earth, and all she does is just wave her magic wand, and all of the outward signifiers of excellence transfer from the people who currently bear them to the people who really deserve them.
Love that.
Yeah, it's easy to think about it as sour grapes, but it's also, you know, of course, you know, paints a really clear picture of how Addison is thinking about, you know, literary merit, personal merit. You know, all the wealth goes to the people who have worked for it, all the whatever. You know, it's this kind of divine redistribution of honor rather than wealth. The second is just a little stanza that I've always loved from Thomas Gray's Elegy on a Country Churchyard, which ends, full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. The kind of climax of the poem, which is about a sort of humble graveyard where sort of unknown lower class people have died and been buried, right? The whole climax of it is this idea that, proud people shouldn't scoff at these lower class dead people, because they as Nick Carraway's father said to him, that not everybody has had the opportunities in life that you have had, right? And so this is like and it occurs to me as we're talking about all of these images that arise in the classics of a kind of hidden elite, that in some sense it requires a concept like the Christian concept of the capital W world, that there is this disconnect between how things are structured outwardly in human society and what's really good and true in the human soul. I mean, I think of even Paul's admonition, right? Let hospitality flourish, because in so doing, some people have entertained angels unawares. And I don't think you would have to be a Christian to have this concept in your head. For example, Ovid's tale of Baucis and Philemon, who also entertain a god, very humble people who entertain a god and then turn out to be richly rewarded because they haven't looked at the outward form. But it's a very strong strain in Christian and Jewish scripture, right? That God looks not on the outward form, but on the inward heart, as he says to Samuel when he's choosing David for king, and so I think that in some sense what we're hitting on is in itself a thread that runs through the classics. I mean, we're getting this idea in some ways from the classics, that that class is a kind of poor shadow of a real distinction between people's souls and works of art.
And this is one reason why so many of the early Christian church fathers loved pagan literature, loved the classical literature, because there was so much that, independent of divine revelation, they thought corroborated and accentuated and helped cultivate Christian tenets. And that's also why I there is so much to be appreciated in the classical, big C classical tradition, ancient Greece and Rome. It gives us so much, and also the Western tradition generally, but there's also much richness in other traditions as well, that kind of help us think more clearly about the human condition and the problems endemic to human life, and actually have a real, there's a remarkable similarity when you kind of look at some of these ethical teachings, or just I'm particularly thinking of Confucius right now, like not in the West, but he wouldn't fall into the big C classics, but he would fall into the, in my opinion, the small C classics. Like his Analects is a great book that that we should read, because it's objectively great and beautiful, but also kind of corroborates just so many timeless principles about how to live life well and flourish in community. And I wanted to give, before we turn to questions, get your questions ready. Anya's going to lead our Q&A session very shortly. But before we do that, I wanted to give Spencer a chance to talk about his area of expertise, which is music in the ancient world. And I wanted to mention that Confucius he's incredibly passionate about music. He thinks that music is what elevates our moral sensibilities, and it elevates the human spirit. It's kind of like Plato's theory of beauty and justice, like that just exposure to beauty and exposure to music for Confucius can make us better human beings. So lots to appreciate, definitely in the big C classical tradition, but also beyond that as well. There's so much that resonates and just contributes to this broadly, humanistic project about helping us think more clearly and live about the human condition and live better lives, more rich lives as human beings. So I wanted to give you a chance, Spencer, to talk about music in the ancient world. Tell us about your work and maybe how that contributes to our conversation today as well.
Right. Well, you're right that much as there have been comparisons between the Analects and Stoic ethics, for example, there was a nice little volume of essays in the 2010s called Music in Ancient Greek and Chinese Societies. I think that's what it's called, something akin to that, which was exploring exactly this fact that the music of the spheres, as we call it, which we get in some sense from Pythagoras via Plato, however accurately Plato may or may not have read the students of Pythagoras or learned from the students of Pythagoras. is also reflected in a Chinese ideology about ethics in music, right? This was the subject of my thesis, was this notion that music doesn't just please us, doesn't just create pleasure, but actually communicates or depicts or shows something to us, has some content. Famously difficult thing to think about, because every time you try to pin it down, you end up sounding a little bit silly, which is what makes it fun. You know, if you say that music depicts, if you say that it's about tone painting, that as the pitch rises, we think about mountains, and as it falls, we think about dejection, then you can find a million examples why that's wrong. If you think that it's about storytelling, then you can find music that doesn't seem to tell any sort of story at all. And it occurred to me that the Greeks have a lot of wonderful insights about this that kind of don't feature into a lot of our modern conversations on the topic. And one of the things that Aristotle says in actually the Politics rather than the Poetics is that whereas other forms of art communicate by way of a kind of middleman, so we see a sculpture with his, with the face furrowed, and we infer a kind of emotional outlook from this. And we derive, however our empathy works, we kind of have empathy with that sculpture, and through that middleman, we get an emotional experience. Aristotle thinks that musicians just carve in the medium of emotion, essentially, that music doesn't represent or stand in for some emotional inner life, but rather recreates it in the medium of sound. And so this very kind of abstruse and heady set of questions was one half of my thesis. And then the other half was that people actually have resuscitated music from the ancient world. There are musical documents with music notation on them that survive, in some cases as far back as we think the 5th century BC, including a play by Euripides that seems to have some music annotated along with it. And so there is a growing scholarly movement to reconstruct and perform this. It's just something people have done for a while, but it's gotten better. People have, especially scholars like Stefan Hagel and my supervisor, Alman Dengor. And the reason that it came up in the context of our discussion before this chat is just that it's actually a really interesting combination of traditionalist academic models along the lines of the old Oxbridge standard of careful, close philology that requires a lot of expertise, and something more intuitive and felt, which is the notion of musical performance, right? I mean, you can't actually talk about music in the abstract without referring in some sense to what you think the performers might have done. Never get there entirely. It'll always be a vague approximation, but yeah, this is what I love about it as a field, actually, is that it kind of erases some of the divides that we've been talking about for this past hour. And so, yeah, it's been a bit since I was really working directly on that. But the book, Music in Ancient Greece, gives a kind of introduction.
We can link to that, Anya, in the Q&A section. Okay, we'll turn it over to Anya for questions and answers. But so thank you all for submitting questions, and feel free to send your questions in now too.
Thank you, Lexi, and thank you, Spencer. First quick question is, which Euripides play is it with the music? Oh,
the Orestes.
Oh, the Orestes, okay.
Yes, it's a chorus from the Orestes. Dromedes o Terraphoroi. It's the chorus are singing about Orestes being tormented. I think it's lines like 300 and something. I'm talking out of my hat now, but it's called the Vienna Papyrus. If you Google it, you will find this sort of snippet of melody.
So our first question is actually quite practical, and it comes from Justin, who I think had to leave, but hopefully he's still there. He asked, I agree that the classics are for everyone, but I would love to know how to integrate some of the classics into my classroom. It would be wonderful to be able to do so while trying it in our state standards. I believe that children are being robbed of the knowledge that could be obtained from the classics, as well as rigorous history. So yeah, it's kind of how can we practically make the classics more accessible, more of interest, and for children as well?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and I always feel a bit humbled by questions from teachers, because I feel like I'm talking the talk and they're walking the walk, and so anything I say should be taken with a grain of salt. But I don't know what specifically this questioner teaches or at what level. But my general piece of insight is that people and kids are up for a lot more than we give them credit for if we take a firm hand in introducing things. If this is another thing I discovered through the podcast, is if you come out with great enthusiasm and do some thinking in your own life about, what is the application. Not every text applies to everything, right? So if you're talking about if you're having a big moral debate, right, it might be more appropriate to bring, say, Kant or Aristotle to the table than it would be to bring, I don't know, say Euripides, for instance. I mean, I'm speaking in generalities, but if you do some thinking about that, you may often find that these rather complicated texts lend themselves to even just a passage. You give people a passage, you say, this might be a little hard, or even don't say this might be hard, because you may be, again, telling them it's hard before they've decided it's hard. Often when I would teach in grad school, undergraduates, my students would surprise me that they didn't actually find things difficult that I thought were difficult. And then they found things incredibly complex that I didn't realize were complex. So I think giving kids more credit, and not just saying, oh, they can't understand Shakespeare, but rather, reading and acting it out with them. I mean, acting out drama is another great way to get people very involved. This is something in the UK a lot of my colleagues did. Classics for All was great at this. Or just, reading things aloud together or applying them to modern debates. I mean, many things, there's passages that come from Aristotle that could be lifted right up and applied to the euthanasia debate or the, whatever politics you're talking about. So there's ways to integrate them, but I think that the key is just not assuming that kids are going to get bored or switch off, or, if you don't switch off, they won't, at least in my experience.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I'm a big theater fan. I was a theater director up in Edinburgh, and my first play I did was Philoctetes. And, it's got so much great, rich conversation and dialogue and debate that, I mean, really great philosophical discussion can come out of seeing that play. All you have to do is sit down and watch a play for a while. It's very accessible. And I'd also like to say that, I think another way we can do is show the non-gravitas classics as well. Like, I think it's always great to have original text and to discuss the things, but the classics are really everywhere, and you can point it out in common things all the time, and it can get people really excited, whether it's, I know, Harry Potter or Percy Jackson, you've got popular TV shows and series. My daughter was watching My Little Pony the other day, and I saw like mythical references in it, and I was like, look, yeah. This is, you can find the classics everywhere. So showing even architecture, just to show that it is already everywhere, that it's not this hugely foreign, exotic thing that exists at the end of 2,000 years, that it's been influencing people right up into this day. And so everyday things, you'll find references to it. I like to do actually like a fun Twitter thing where you find like the most random reference to the classics. And my submission was going to be, there is a coconut bar for, mojitos in like a stand on a beach in Rio, and it's called Socrates.
That's great. Mine would definitely come from video games. They're all over video games. I think there was one. Oh yeah, there's Anacreon. Isn't there a planet called Anacreon in Dune or something? Anyway, this happens all the time. And yes, what's so great about that is that, besides the fact that it's fun to watch like 300 or some popular reproduction, is that shows exactly what classics is, which is a tool for understanding the world you live in, right? To showing that these things that are there, these rules that exist, these buildings that exist, like, are not arbitrary, but actually had thought that went into them that you can learn about and then can recognize and understand. It's like really important.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a way of thinking, rather, like, you don't have to memorize anything. You could just absorb things and change your perspective, which kind of delves into the next question from David. He says, I find that people, especially students, are looking for answers to explain that the classics raise questions more than they supply definite answers, puts many off. Shakespeare provides no answers. He raises questions. How do we overcome that? Many are looking for easy answers and believe that if they read the classics, they will learn those answers. And I just to say, I realize that there's like kind of a life hack culture going on. And, how do we combat that when it comes to the rigor that maybe the classics involve?
Yeah, this is so interesting. William F. Buckley, sort of famous for the parting shot that started the culture wars, was said at one point that he was an epistemological optimist, which by which he meant that he actually did think there were answers that had been settled that were better than others. And I'm sympathetic to that view. Actually, I think that the totally open-ended view of classics doesn't quite get at the resounding success of an argument like Augustine's argument about whether God can make a stone so heavy he can't lift it, or Aristotle's about the role of pleasure in the ethical life. But your point is completely well taken. That I see on Instagram like 5 Stoic life hacks.
Yeah.
And I'm like, first of all, whence? Like, where did this come from? And second of all, I'm not sure that that's the right use of that. I don't know if you're using
I should say though, like for like with the Stoics and stuff like that, I think, I like to think of it as a gateway drug. So like if Marcus Aurelius and the meditations bring you interest into that world, then that's great. But like maybe it should be the starting point.
So here's my actual, working around to what I think is the approach that's worked for me is life is long, and I like to try on an author. I especially used to do this when I was young. I would read an author and just try living my life as if I agreed with everything he said or she said, and discover ways in which it was impossible to do that and remain human, and ways in which it was very edifying to do that. And I think that, many authors do provide answers, and there's no shame in endorsing those answers or trying to, see if those answers are worthy of your endorsement. And you don't have to do it forever. I mean, this is one thing that you might suggest to a student that wants answers for their life is, well, here's an answer. Try it out and report back to me, within reason. Don't tell them like try to jump off a bridge or whatever, but Augustine's not going to tell them to jump off a bridge. So yeah, I think you could suggest to that student that if you want an answer, there's one here, try it out for a week, come back to me, I'll give you a new one and see if that one's better.
Oh, I love that. And, it's so funny because, I studied at St. John's. So you read each book kind of in order. And at the time, because you're so young and you're so impressionable, each week you think, oh, this must be the answer. And at the end, you're really confused. But I think part of the value of that is realizing, that you don't know everything. And that is humbling and important. And the only way you can learn is to realize that you don't know it already. So, maybe that's part of the value. The next question is a personal one to yourself. When and how did you become interested in the classics?
So like many people, and this actually perhaps should have figured more prominently into our previous discussion, I should have raised this. Like many people who do classics for some sort of a living, I had a phenomenal teacher. I had 2 phenomenal teachers, actually, Magister Haycock and Magister Anderson. And they were both, notable for precisely the reason that I suggested earlier, which was that they just didn't let you even, they didn't even let you raise the question whether this was exciting or interesting to talk about. They found it so exciting and interesting that it simply wasn't even a premise. And so, that dimension of it was profoundly formative for me. But I also think that I always had a kind of attraction to a quality of thought and life that I've only ever been able to describe as richness. And this is something that is very squishy and ineffable, and yet real, that I feel and experience in certain texts, even if I strenuously disagree with them. I mean, a good example would be the Communist Manifesto, right? There is an enormous richness for me in reading that book, even though I think almost every sentence of it is wrong, and that's because it is, it has a richness of thought and engagement with the world that has made my soul bigger. You know, every chapter of it makes your soul bigger. And so I was very young. I was like in 7th grade or so when I kind of noticed this about myself.
That's fantastic, and it's so funny because everybody has a different way to come into the classics, and I guess that's an interesting point because, you know, if the misapprehension that the classics are just for the elite, that it is something sort of just generationally passed down within a certain class, the irony is that that's always a great question to ask classicists because you get such a wide array, and that the current culture of people who are studying the classics aren't necessarily elitists, that there are from all different backgrounds, and it's a personal decision of choosing the classics. It's not just handed down.
Can I just ask, Anya, how you got started before we go on to the next question?
You know, well, it's funny. I was going to say handed down. My mother used to read the Odyssey to me and my brothers when we were kids. But you know, at the time, I felt like I kind of randomly fell into it. And only recently, I was going through a storage and I saw all these like things from my high school, like notes from, because I went to boarding school, seeing like comments and stuff like that. And I only in hindsight realized that there was already a seeding of it because I kind of went to St. John's kind of randomly, you know, and it's such a weird college.
Yeah.
For anybody who doesn't know St. John's, it's a great books program when you study Greek and ancient Greek and you just discuss it around a table, and it's a really interesting thing. But I was fascinated originally with art history.
Wow.
And I love theater. So I remember putting on Antigone when I was younger. And so for me, it was the plays and the art and the architecture. And so it may be a different route than most people. Yep. I don't know what the most common answer is, to be honest.
That would be another good poll.
Yeah, next time. We have a few more questions though, so I'd like to get to them before we go. I don't want to keep you too long, but there are a few comments first. One from Con is, let's have a day called International Classics Day, like we have World Teachers Day, and I love that idea.
Absolutely.
The next one from Sean, he says, I've been watching the HBO series Succession recently, convinced the writers have studied classics, lots of references. So I think that's another, you know, when you see references, once you start seeing them, you can see them everywhere. And so here's another question. Spencer, thank you for your insights. What is your best advice for schools and teachers that are struggling to acclimate parents and students to the classical life? I have taught in multiple schools where the culture of the community is out of shape in the sense of regards to the intellectual life. From the perspective of so many, engaging the great books is too intimidating. How can a community meet people where they're at without watering down the great works?
Yeah. Well, Anya, I really liked your suggestion that classics are not always sort of fusty and imposing. And I'd like to complement it with, you know, I think you were making that point in the sense of the use of, you know, what you might call reception, you know, the classics in the outside world that pop up. But I'd like to complement it with the fact that actual classic texts are not all created equal when it comes to their entertainment value. And I think we can be totally honest about that and talk about like the fact that Aristophanes is a hilarious writer of you know, disgusting smut. And it might be an easier inroad, you know, and I think you've talked about theater, right? You can start these things small and get a group together, you know, perhaps of people that are interested or people that are just a little bit maybe questioning, and you know, read the Frogs and see if you can put on like a play of it before you even get to talking about, well, why, you know, does this play exist? Like, what was the context? And I think there's a lot of, you know, we tend to neglect comedy and scoff at it. Shakespeare's comedies, you know, don't get the same play that the tragedies and the histories do. And I think that probably you could get some mileage in a community like that out of silly classics, like classics that aren't like super imposing and hyper serious all the time.
Yeah, and I think a good point to tell teachers and parents is that this idea of the great conversation. And so Lexi and I, last two ones we had was with Anika Prather of St. John's and Angel Parham. And, we talked a lot about the importance of the classics in the civil rights movement and how it has influenced, MLK and Du Bois, people like that, that this idea that you have this great conversation that has been going throughout history. And no matter what time period you're interested in, there is a point where you can find influence. So if you're really interested in, ancient Persian philosophy or the Islamic Golden Age, they were heavily influenced by Aristotle. So the amount of unraveling that happens, it's great to get to a lot of the base of that tree, of that conversation, and to realize that you're part of a longer tradition of having that conversation, no matter how deep you go into it, that it's worthwhile to be able to understand everybody who's come before you because they've been part of that conversation. And I was just thinking, really before when Lexi was mentioning Spinoza, another great modern philosopher is Rousseau, who was going to be an artisan, who was supposed to be an artisan, and fell in love with Petrarch's Lives, and found himself breaking away from that life because of the love of classics as well. But here's another question to take us out of the school. And I think this might be our last one, or I think there's a few comments about how everybody's saying, can we please create more books about why we need the classics? And I think that's, to be honest, something that we've been trying to do at Classicalism. I'm sure is what you've been doing as well at Young Heretics, what Lexi's been doing at Civic Renaissance. So, but this question from Eric is, what about outside school context? If the classics are good for us just as humans, can we talk about how we can integrate and talk about these lessons of the classics just in daily life and conversation?
Absolutely. This is more my wheelhouse, actually, in some ways, in the sense of my daily bread. And I think a lot about, so I have this smaller community of people on Locals, which is a kind of a social media platform, but, you may call it an alternative social media platform. And this is the point of it, right? And by the way, come join us, youngheretics.com/locals. But it's, the point of it is that we do weekly live stream Q&As, and, the people who come to it are mostly out of school. They're not going to be going back and getting another degree anytime soon. And they wouldn't want to, they're really there to be talking about how this is going to help them raise their kids or do their job or find a spouse or like whatever, normal people concerns. And I think that this is something that, you can do. This is really where the internet kicks in. Like, you can do this tomorrow. You can decide on a text that you've always wanted to read. You can find somebody that is great at lecturing about it online. You can make a reading group together. This is one of the things that I stress all the time, because people hear me or you or anybody talk about these works and they get super excited, and then they crack a book open and they're like, I cannot understand, I cannot fathom this, and that's because, there's just like background information they don't have, or it's just a totally foreign thing to them. But reading groups are phenomenal, because like even people that have never encountered these texts will have different questions and different things that they don't understand. All of these things you can do online super, super easily. And you can then, you can read them with an eye to figuring out what to do about them in your real life, right? How does this, constantly be asking, how does this information help me? How's it working out for me? How does it, change the way that I think about the problem that I have tomorrow in the morning? The internet is just like, if that's something you want to do, the internet is your friend. It's not your friend in every respect, but it's absolutely your friend in this respect.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of resources, but I think it's really handy to, if you're intimidated by a text or you're overwhelmed by it, to approach it like a battle at many fronts. So, okay, my husband recently was reading Ulysses by James Joyce, and he was like, okay, so I'm going to get the texts for critical articles about it. He's reading podcasts, because if you're just reading completely in isolation, and, we're down here in El Fin del Mundo, and the end of the world, and and especially in the last year, you might have been stuck at home for a long time, much more isolated. But there are articles you can read. There are podcasts. Like, I love nothing more than putting on a good podcast, going for a long walk about a different subject that I want to be introduced into. And so from that podcast, you hear some more things. You think, okay, I'm going to learn about this other person, but I think another big point, and this is something Zena Hitz always talks about in her Loss of Thought, but is claiming our leisure time. And I think this is a hard thing to do, but we do have so many distractions in our lives, and to make time for reading, for discussion, for literature, for podcasts, making that a priority in your own life. And, you know, I often say we've got our Essential Classics. It's a beautiful anthology of Greek and Roman stuff. And I tell people, like, you know, when you're like bored for a second and you pick up your phone, instead of that, pick up an anthology and read a page, you know?
Yeah, totally. It's such a good point. And, you know, sometimes I think about this in terms of food. You know, if you're really, really hungry, the first thing that you want to go for is a big bag of M&Ms. You know, there's just, because there's just, you can sense that there's kind of a lot of caloric material in it. If you are thinking about it for 1 second, there's like kind of an activation energy that requires to be like, you know, I'm actually going to eat a steak, you know.
Almonds or something.
Almonds, sorry, yeah, whatever, like you like, you know, there's things that are good for you, and things that have actual nutritional content in it that won't end you up feeling, because, you know, you eat the bag of M&Ms, you're still going to be hungry and you're going to feel gross, you know, like you're going to feel disgusting. And this is true also with that kind of activation energy that it takes, like right as you're about to pick up your phone. You know, it's the easiest thing in the world. What you're hungry for is something to devote your attention to, right? You have an attention hunger. And so it's like, this is the thing that will satisfy that immediately. I'll be entertained. But like, if you 5 minutes after you pick the book up, you'll be so glad you did. And yeah, it does take that little exertion of the will.
I love that. That is a fantastic imagery and metaphor. So I think that works really well for helping explain it. But so maybe on that point, maybe we should leave and say thank you so much, Spencer, for your time and energy. And I would highly suggest everybody check out your podcast, Young Heretics. We'll put links as well to your excellent work at the Claremont Review and the American Mind. And I want to say thank you also on behalf of Lexi. We have enjoyed doing these great series on the great conversation. So I'm very happy that all of you can join us today.
Thank you, Anya. It's been such a pleasure. And thanks to Lexi as well in absentia.